Rukhadze had sabotaged his own legacy.
I would say that is a political suicide.
If anybody's radical, it's the Georgian Dream.
This is what China says. This is what North Korea does.
Bidzina is a very, very specific figure.
We've never been so close to be part of European project. But at the same time, we've never been so close to be a dictatorship.
You need to revive politics and the idea that there might be hope. Wait, we didn't want you to do all that.
Hello and welcome to Talk Georgia, which is my English podcast covering Georgian and regional politics. Talk Georgia is brought to you by Droeba Media Group, a trusted source of high-quality news and analytical media content. And also GSAC, a think tank providing comprehensive analysis of Georgia and wider Black Sea region, also academic and practical training for postgraduate students and mid-career professionals. So to dive into the key questions of the Georgian politics, today we are privileged to be joined by Mr. Hans Gutbrod, who is a full professor at Ilia State University, is senior fellow at Center for Peace and Conflict Studies at Seton Hall University. He is executive director of Transparify, which is a global initiative assessing financial transparency of policy research organizations. In the past, he was country director of CRRC, which is like Caucasus...
Regional director, that's
regional director, okay. Caucasus Research Resource Center, which is the biggest research data database in the region, or maybe beyond. He's got long experience of observing elections in this country. From 1999 to 2005, he was observing almost every single election in this country and also away from this country in Azerbaijan, in Ukraine, if I'm not mistaken. Yes. He holds a PhD degree in international relations from London School of Economics, and he studied international economics at the same university before as a bachelor's course. Mr. Gutbrod, you're very welcome to the show.
Thank you.
Please feel free to add anything to your biography.
Thank you. That's been quite extensive already. Some of the things not even that active anymore, but yes, it's been very extensive, and so thank you for the invitation.
Again, before we dive into the political issues that there's a lot to discuss, obviously, my first question would be, what brought you to Georgia? Okay, because I know you appeared here in late 1990s, and at that time you were putting finishing touches to your PhD studies in London. So why Georgia? Yeah. Why Caucasus region?
So I came in 1999 with what was called the Civic Education Project. That was a Soros-funded entity. Of course, nowadays people around the world attack that. I think it was a great example of a great initiative where people that were, as they're often described, ADB, all but dissertation, ABD, all but dissertation people who are in the finishing their dissertations, where they were sent out, essentially the academic equivalent of the Peace Corps sent out to teach. And this was a great learning experience for me. It was, I think, for some students the chance to have English language instruction, but also get a very different perspective. And so for me, it was a very interesting time. I saw Tbilisi State University. They tried to keep us out. That was keep foreign lecturers out as far as possible. That was under Roy Metravelli and the terrible state that Tbilisi State University was in at the time. I was teaching just around the corner from where we're recording this in the technical university. But primarily, I tried to engage with individual students and help them learn and engage with them. And in many cases, these turned into friendships, but also people really made their own way. And so it's now seen quite negatively, but I think it was one of the best, or by some quarters, I think it was one of the best. One of the best kinds of engagement that you could offer, that you select people, it was a minimal stipend, you select people for enthusiasm, and then you see a little bit what happens. And I think a lot of good things happened from that.
Good. So I checked your page at Ilia State University, and one of the courses you taught was turning points in recent Georgian politics. And my question, the next question is about that. What does recent politics mean? I mean, is it 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, 25 years? And obviously, yeah, in your opinion, what were those turning points in the modern Georgian history? And also, where are we now? Are we at a turning point now, or have we already passed that turning point?
Yeah, so maybe to start with, to navigate the present, it really matters what kind of account you have of the world you move in. And as one can say, or as I often say, it's a novel, it's not a cartoon. And if you look at the world as a cartoon, in which the lineup is very, very easy in terms of, and it's the goodies and the baddies, is very, very simple, and it's like a Marvel movie, this kind of thing, I think you will struggle to really have the kind of impact you want to have. You might have an impact, but with quite adverse consequences. And so the question of even how you look at the past and how you influences how you will navigate the present. And then the question becomes, how do we look at particular moments in time? And one of the ways of really refreshing the way that you look at time is not just to think of it as a stream of one thing happens after the other, but maybe you look at particular moments in order to understand, like a snapshot, like a photograph that captures all sorts of different people doing different things at the same time and going in a particular direction, to have a richer understanding of what goes on. And the way that I thought, that I think is often most interesting, is if you pick a turning point that is less than obvious. If you take the most obvious turning point, then lots of people have written about it. It's quite clear, so to speak, it's hyper dramatic. But let's take something like the one election that I observed. You had mentioned observing elections, the election April 9, 2000, in which Shevardnadze's team cheated in very, very badly. I saw that myself. I was in Martvili at the time. There were stacks of ballots in the that were neatly stacked, and then it was very, very crude. And in a way, I experienced that as a turning point. Why? Because prior to that, people thought, well, Shevardnadze is broadly okay. He brought stability back. He recreated a degree of statehood when everything was falling apart. It's the people around and under him that really are the problem. The Minister of Interior, the other.
It's like king is good, but servants are bad, and
yes.
That story.
And I think that moment in 2000 where that's the way that I experienced it in the year there of being there, where people early on said, well, maybe Shevardnadze is trying to fix it, but he's just struggling, he's balancing these different... And then it became very, very clear to people there. You can also say there was a couple of other things. There was a 60-minute program about Ryan Mitrovelli, and then thereafter, which exposed all the corruption at TSU, and thereafter Shevardnadze came they came twice in the space of 3 weeks, came to Tbilisi State University, just to underline that he was supporting Mitrovelli. Yeah. And that, I think, for a lot of people was also something where they realized the problem is not Ryan Mitrovelli. The problem deeply and profoundly is Shevardnadze. So I think April 9, all sorts of things are really interesting, because it wasn't really against Jumber Patiashvili, if I remember the surname correctly. It wasn't a real election. And still they felt the need to cheat. And I think that way in which that Shevardnadze had sabotaged his own legacy at that moment. So many things come together, and throwing a light on that's interesting. And then if we look, for example, at the run-up to the Rose Revolution, lots of people have written about what happened on that particular day around Parliament, between Freedom Square and going back through the back roads. But if you look at what happened a few days before, which was the interesting moments of showing the film from Serbia on the Psycho program with some of the same people that now are commentators. Salomea Satyani, Lasha Rukhadze was there. Gogig and how that really impacted the imagery that people expected. And then the resignation in public television, I always garble the surname, was it Shengelia?
Shengelia.
And how that suddenly people were going, oh, so maybe what we were being served up wasn't true. And then the little moment of violence that I saw in Bolnisi with a Gumgibeli who couldn't calibrate his violence properly because he got very drunk before the violence and ended up then having to run away. So there were all these things that are actually incredibly interesting, and this is, in my mind, they're worthwhile to look at as turning points because you can tease out some of the complexity, and precisely because people don't necessarily feel that this is the moment of the historical where all the lights go on, like people posing a little bit for photographs. That's what often happens when it's a key moment. But sometimes these moments that are turning points, but like in jazz, the beat is a little bit off the main rhythm. You can tell a lot about the main story. And yes, of course, right now we're in a really, really profound crisis in the ancient sense of the word. I mean, that also has the possibility of a better development, but it is a deep crisis.
Okay, interesting indeed. The next question that I want to ask you, and I want to use your, this institutional knowledge of Georgia, again, observing Georgian politics almost for a quarter of a century, and also your advantage to be distant or to be neutral, at least, if it is possible. I mean, if I put it correctly. For example, I can give you my own example that only after I left Georgia, at least for considerable time, I started noticing some of those things about Georgia that I was not able to do it when I was in Georgia. Because when you're looking at a picture, you need certain distance to notice all the aspects of it, and also to neutrally assess it. Because when you're in love with a picture, then you are not a good, you are not someone who should be kind of neutrally assessing it. And in that regard, I think that what is your opinion? What is something that the Georgians don't see themselves because they are too close to the picture, and maybe mistakes that they make and they don't realize, or the steps that they kind of make, and it is impossible to notice from very close distance. I mean, people don't feel their own odor, but the others do. And again, as I told you, for example, before leaving Georgia, I thought some of those stories about that you hear about Georgia, how special this nation is, how God under God's protection, etc., it is. Then you start kind of realizing that there might be some other special nations as well, or other special places as well, and other beautiful places as well. Okay, a good example is that probably, I'm sure you heard the story how Georgia became Georgia. You would hear it on every party or at the table where people drink wines, that the God was giving away lands, for example. And then, Georgians were drinking wine at that moment, partying somewhere. They got drunk, so they were late. Then next day they turned up there, and God said that, sorry guys, but you're late now. And they started moaning about that, how could you possibly leave us without the land, because all nations got their land, etc. And then God starts thinking that, what, you seem to be a good people, so I had something for myself when I would retire, this nice piece of land with the mountains and the seas and the rivers and all that, and I'm giving it to you. Guys, and because of the story, a lot of Georgians kind of believe that this land is under God's protection, Mother Mary, etc. All that story, and I was really surprised first time when I heard exactly the similar story in one of the Scottish pubs, but with different twist at the end. The story runs exactly the same way. Scots were drinking their whiskey somewhere, and the God was handing out these lands. They were late. Finally, God decided to, give them something, and exactly the same story, that I had something for when I would retire from being a god. I had some patch of land for myself, and with the rivers and lands and mountains and etc. I'm giving it to you. But because you are a irresponsible bunch, I'm going to punish you. And you're going to have terrible weather, and you're going to have a neighbor in the south. Mm-hmm. So the Scots referring English there. So, but in the Georgian element, there is no part of that. So the reason I gave you this story that the farther I was away from Georgia, I did realize that there are also other special nations, special lands, beautiful, etc. And this whole idea of Georgia being special, yeah, it's kind of course, it's a nice country, and it is special in a way that it survived a lot of conquerors, and empires disappeared, and Georgia still is there, as a nation. But again, it needs a certain distance to assess and realize what is happening in your country. And if from that context, I want to ask you that what is something that Georgians don't notice about themselves, they don't see about themselves, or maybe overestimate or underestimate, and how that affects them as a nation, okay, them as a state, for example.
Of course,
Georgia complex
question. This is a great question. Yeah. And of course, Georgia is a special place, and of course, I actually I wouldn't be here if I didn't love it, and I mean that kind of profoundly.
Sure, absolutely.
And so what makes Georgia really...
I didn't mean that you didn't love Georgia.
Yeah, no. I didn't understand it to be that way. One of the things that makes Georgia totally unique, and of course we have that in some of these accounts that then, in my understanding, Viet Gamsogutje and various people had thought about over the time. But when you look at the contemporary world map, one thing that it obscures is that Georgia was where institutionalized Christendom, so to speak, or a Christian country, directly interacted with Persia. And so that you had, and Persia as one of the profound and deep and really essential cultures over the last millennia. And that gets reflected in all sorts of ways. I've written a longer piece on how that's reflected in the myth of St. George, for example. There's something very, very specific that connects to that also. And because now you look at the map and you think, oh, there's Azerbaijan, and you then, with that, you forget that if to the extent that it was a border, of course, sometimes parts of Georgia were under that Persian control, but to the extent that there was a border, it was a long day's walk away. And that is so profound, and so all sorts of things then happen in this particular context through that. And there's other ways, of course, in which that liminality, or whatever you want to call it, but that moment of being in this particular context ends up making Georgian history very peculiar. To what extent it's more special, I don't think there's a need to compare. Yeah, it's the key thing is just to note that. So in terms of what do people not see about themselves, well, look, I mean, the vantage point of an outsider is always one where you have to pay close attention. And that could be that you're a Megrelian and you move to Tbilisi and you have to try and get a particular context, or that you come out from the regions and you have to try and learn the codes of the city, or it could be that you're an outsider in many other ways. And so that is always something where you pay very close attention. I mean, I understand some reasonable Georgian, but of course when I talk to people in Georgian, I have to pay extra attention to all the clues because I'm trying to read what the situation is. And so all of this dialectic of what does it mean to be inside, what does it mean to be outside, is always one that's very refreshing. I'm not particularly sure that there's so entirely unique blind spots, because people tend to give abbreviated accounts of their place in the world, which is often something about trying to find themselves, and ends up sometimes being a slightly cruder version that if you polish it up a little bit, it ends up being something that really can stand, where there's a kernel of truth, where sometimes it gets presented, or we're so particularly special, and then almost trying to take something away from other people. And when you balance that out, it becomes, there is an interesting thing going on there. I would say that sometimes the way that Georgians beat themselves up about something, that they go, oh, we're so terrible at this and that, that we're right into politics. Oh, our opposition parties are so totally useless. Well, if you would listen to what people say in Israel about opposition parties, and there's no shortage there of capable people, former generals, etc., a lot of those things are exchangeable. And so that I think that, but that's true for almost any vantage point, any perspective, that really to understand it and then fully inhabit it, you have to alienate yourself from time to time from where you really are so that you can come back. And of course, that's a functional role of art, of literature, maybe of some theories. And I think it's important to have that agility to be able to move. And I think, again, there's some ways in which a Georgian struggle is one that you feel reflected in lots of places also.
All right. Again, now let's dive a bit into the current affairs. For example, again, we have to face the fact that the overwhelming majority of the opposition leaders are in prison.
Yes.
And that this is something that I don't remember since the conception of Georgian state. Of course, there were dark periods in Georgian history, recent history, and also there were times when the politicians were in prison, but the majority of the political leaders being in prison, I don't recall. I don't remember. That's one thing. The second thing is that it's not just the political leaders, that now Ivanishvili's regime is trying to crack down on civil society organizations by the use of the Russian law and FARA 1, FARA 2, all that stuff. Also, physically, you see violence on the streets, almost on a daily basis. Somebody gets bitten because he sang a song, or I don't know, did something, or criticized the government. You have this situation when, again, almost number one person in Ajara, let's say a year ago, now is getting treated in Ankara hospital or Istanbul hospital because he wanted to kill himself. And the government is trying to sell us a story that this man drove more than 300 miles from Ajara to Sagarejo and picked up his friend's gun that happened to sit on the dining table and shot himself twice in the chest. And meantime, he managed to write a letter, to Ivanishvili and Rukhadze and his family or whatever. So, I mean, who can buy that? I don't know. But this is what is happening. The prominent business people are getting in jail or at least arrested for another good story. For example, Netflix, a ready-made Netflix scenario. So the man who is a multimillionaire is traveling to Paris with his gun in his hand luggage. And his gun gets discovered when he's going through the security control in Tbilisi International Airport. I mean, unthinkable, simply.
Yeah.
And you see this, very clear crackdown from the Ivanishvili's regime on the political parties, on the civil society organizations, on the critically minded people, on the critically minded media, journalists personally, and these elements of mafia state when even their associates or former high-ranking officials are getting either shot or arrested. And I didn't mention Ivanishvili's former ally, Bachiashvili, who was, kidnapped who knows where, most likely it was in the United Arab Emirates, and was brought in Georgia like a luggage. Okay? Yeah. And my question is that at what stage of consolidation of dictatorship or autocracy we are in now? I mean, is it fully consolidated? And some of those islands of freedom that you can still see, it's just a remain of the past, and it will disappear as it goes? Or where are we from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's a moment where nuanced analysis is particularly important. And the terms we use and the categories, they themselves are can become traps. And when we talk about this kind of authoritarian assault, and then we say, you do your own lineup, but you say, well, Putin, Orban, Trump, Ivanishvili. What it risks obscuring is how different all of them are. And one thing that's really quite distinct about Ivanishvili is how he runs very much against what I think would be quite typical Georgian cultural expressions or ideas. I've written a tiny piece about that at some point where I said, someone like Dimitri Khipiani is really an interesting figure, the kind of slightly, still mentor, at least half a generation earlier, to Chavchavadze and Tsereteli. And he writes the Georgian grammar, or an important Georgian grammar, and he also translates Shakespeare. So somehow the idea there seems to be to become more Georgian means to become more European. So these are not, if you're sitting in the middle of Europe, becoming more European, you go, the Dutch would go, wait, we're supposed to become more like the Germans? Why would we ever do that? So here it really meant being kind of connecting to something quite different. And so what the Georgian Dream does right now is it has a radical break in itself. And so I'm sometimes a little troubled by these accounts that I think mislead in a particular way, where it goes, oh, everything was already there from 2012. And yes, in retrospect, you always see seeds, so to speak, and that you can, but everything there was programmed in 2012, and it's just been a single crescendo. When in fact, we really see these differences, that the difference between someone like Karabashvili, who in some ways is a very recognizable type. It's a very recognizable type with his family and his father-in-law and other Kakheti families. Absolutely. And you somehow make sure that everyone's okay, and you kind of... And then we have someone like Rukhadze, who to me is a very recognizable type as very quite dogmatic, highly dogmatic German-trained lawyer, who's almost like a radical cardinal. And so the switch that we see in my mind, there is a switch around 2020 with Ivanishvili, where it gets a lot darker. That's connected to the Credit Suisse case. And then there's this other switch that happened 1.5 years ago, and that I think is incredibly unsettling for inside the Georgian Dream also. And so now we've seen all of these other core figures that have been shifted away. So Liluashvili, but also some of the deputies. And some of the deputies, for example, I mean, one figure there that was, to me, seemed interesting, someone like Shengeli Pitzkelauri, a deputy in state security, who is the father of Beira's sister-in-law. So you had a lot of dynastic things that now are getting exchanged. And so what we really see there is the Georgian Dream that is in some ways is not a classical party. It's the political vehicle of a single man. It doesn't, the grievance that other people run on, other authoritarians run on, in Trump's case, immigration, which is a real issue for a good chunk of the American electorate. Not if you're doing very well and you're in the Davos class, but otherwise it is a real issue. Or for Orban, it's the Treaty of Trianon, which was a terrible, terrible treaty or trauma for the Hungarians. There isn't really that comparable trauma. I mean, they try and manufacture it quite successfully and somehow try and convince lots of people that maybe their sons could become gay. But in the end, I mean, this is what the Georgian Dream is trying to do, is a very, very brazen. It's a very, very risky project. Often these authoritarians, Trump is now a little bit different, is they're quite cautious in particular ways. They do what's often described as salami tactics. They cut off little bits. And what we now see is if anybody's radical, it's the Georgian Dream. It's not the opposition, which essentially says, well, we just wanted to do what we've been doing for the last 30 years, move more towards Europe. And instead, there's somebody who yanks the country around in entirely the opposite direction of what they promised themselves to offer to the Georgian people. So that makes it, I'm not saying that that means there's an easy resolution and that we just need to wait a couple of weeks and everything's going to be okay. But it's also, getting back to my earlier point, if you just talk about all the bad news in a single place, it looks like the Death Star to you, like from Star Wars. It looks like there's just absolutely, you don't see the particular weaknesses. And I think it's important at this point to have precise analysis. And there is something in the Georgian Dream that is so radically incoherent that if it were to collapse in 4 or 5 weeks' time, everybody would go, well, of course this was going to happen.
Well, but it didn't. It didn't. And
Yes.
I partially disagree with you when I wouldn't really put Ivanishvili and Trump and Orban in the same basket in the way that, of course, when you're looking at Trump or Orban, you see this the authoritarian inclinations, but
Yes.
I wouldn't really call them or classify them as dictators.
Yeah.
But dictator is something else, and Ivanishvili basically shows signs that he is a dictator. While Trump, Orban, and Fico, and some of the politicians that are elected politicians and expect to continue with the elected politicians, they are more, I mean, they have these inclinations with the authoritarianism. Also, you have different type of dictators. Also, that they are classical dictators, for example, Aliyev, but he plays as a politician and has got national interests and
Yes.
follows that. For example, what happened in Nagorno-Karabakh, etc., and how Azerbaijan managed to get the lands back.
Mm-hmm.
Well, that shows that it's been prepared for at least, if not a decade, but quite a long time. And being a dictator does not hamper with this national idea. But with Ivanishvili, it seems that there is no national idea about Georgia. There is no national interests.
Yeah.
The only, basically, the message that is coming from Ivanishvili and his regime is just to avoid war. Well, and then that's the attempt to play on fears.
Yes.
And just simply to sustain power.
Yep.
But again, just to remark about these dictators and dictatorship. That brings me to a next question, which is we see, that Ivanishvili is consolidating autocracy. He's a dictator. He is doing some things that was unthinkable before. If you look back, 3 years ago, if somebody told me that the ruling party in this country would throw majority of the politicians in jail, I would say there's no way that they would do it. If somebody told me again a few years back that Kobakhidze would come out and say that we unilaterally stop Euro integration process, I would say that is a political suicide for any politician, let's say 3 years ago. And the list is very long, and you can continue. But we are now facing a new normal maybe not for us, but from the Ivanishvili's perspective. And he is introducing this, like the one-party state is okay. He had an interview before the elections, by the way, where he said that why there is need for many parties. We have a party, and if there are any good people, they could come to us. This is what China says. This is what North Korea does. I think that the significant shift, let's say 2 years ago when Georgia was a young democracy or immature democracy or whatever it was, now it is absolutely different in a way. My question to you is that where is it going? I mean, I see that they backed themselves in the corner in a way that the Ivanishvili doesn't really have a lot of choice. I mean, the only choice he has to continue repressions as much as possible before he finally cracks down all the dissent that can spring up anywhere.
Yeah.
Well, that's the only way. And also this illusion that he's going to settle relations with the United States, and presently we have this scandal of them sending a letter that Ambassador Danagan describes as insulting, threatening, and unserious. I mean, I don't know. How can you possibly do that? But they managed to do it. Okay, so where is it going? And where's the hard bottom there? Hard rock. I mean, did we hit the hard bottom already, and then we are kind of just bouncing back? Will bounce, or there is kind of long way to go. And also, let's move to what is the solution to this, because again, you can talk about that the opposition is doing this or doing that and they are not good enough to unite, and also if you ask me, I don't really understand what else could happen as a pretext to get united. I don't know. I mean, but whatever. Yeah. And the people are coming, still protesting. It's 222nd day, it was yesterday. They still come to Rustaveli, block Avenue every night. The protest is there, maybe ever shrinking numbers, but still it's there. But what is missing there? What is something that we are not doing right? Well, in your opinion, of course, and maybe a lot of questions together, but what Germans or Brazilians or British would do it differently in this kind of situation? I don't know.
Well, these are great questions. So we don't know where it's going. I think one of the lessons, when one often says this about wars, it's easy to get into them. It's quite hard to stop. Mm-hmm. And Stephen Jones said this about, and I think in a really excellent article that he wrote for op-ed, he wrote for EurasiaNet, he said, with reference to the speech last year, the April 29 speech, he said that started with a sentence along the lines, on April 29, Bidzina Ivanishvili, in his speech on Rustaveli, declared war on the Georgian people. Mm. And this is really what I think is quite an apt description. And so that is, in the end, is a war, and it's actually quite a good term, because he brought almost a state of war back. Normally, as a state, you're supposed to protect people, including those you don't like. That's what you're supposed to do. And instead we have this what in some political theory is described, that's actually the rebel, because the rebel is to rebellare, to bring the state of war back into, and we have that with the figures, that the beating up of the police, etc., that you now need to worry about that, worry about the state as that being the enemy of people that want to express themselves and have their own opinions. So where this stops, we don't know. The problem, I think, will be for the Georgian Dream that it's also not so easy to communicate internally what you don't want to happen. Mm-hmm. So I think it is perfectly possible that somebody will decide at some point that because they understood something maybe slightly wrongly, or thought that they need to demonstrate their loyalty, that actually they'll need to kill someone. Because that's the way that you really demonstrate loyalty, that's what you do, under these circumstances. And at that point to go, wait, we didn't want you to do all that. That is going to be very, very difficult. And we know, and I agree that Bidzina is a very, very specific figure. And comparing him to others in many ways is very difficult, because he doesn't enjoy politics. We know that. He wants to be in Cekvitili, he wants to be out in a Bastomani. And I've written this long essay, it's come out in German, it hasn't really appeared in English, where I described him to a Macbeth kind of figure, with quite a lot of merits early on, clearly capacity that he then translates into political capital, and then at some point just gets caught up in his ghosts. And that's what we seem to be having, because he is caught up in ghosts. He is caught up with that specter of Credit Suisse. And you could say that the analysis that Georgia is in a very, very complicated geopolitical position, that story that they give out, yes, I think that's an accurate analysis to make. But then the question is, what results from that? And you would have three very, very clear commandments that come out of that. A, you try to bring the people together, not in a naive sense that everyone's going to get on, but you don't amp up internal divisions, because you may need to take people along for extraordinary measures. Second thing you would do is you would strengthen institutions, so that precisely you can deal with the questions of human temptation that Bidzina has talked about, and instead what we have is Susi chasing around the state security, chasing around cases of corruption, and then trying to use almost street methods of dealing with this corruption, which is not sustainable, and you cannot really run a state on that. And third, you would try and work with your partners, and in that case, Aliyev is an interesting example. Aliyev is not a model of nuance exactly, but in terms of foreign politics, is almost Bismarckian in how he manages to maneuver between and manages to kind of pick fights with the Kremlin at various points. So he's very, very subtle in that, and none of that we see with what they're doing. And so even if the analysis of some of the problems that some of the people that are trying to offer on behalf of the Georgian Dream, even if that were entirely plausible, the solutions are entirely wrong. So where that ends, I think, in my view, was, I would have said that anyway, but I think expecting the worst, that it was going to escalate further and further, that's something and expecting that it will just stop, we just have to survive this week or the next week, and then it won't be that bad. No, it will be that bad. And in part, our narrative, how can I say, the way we write about it is, and the classical policy memos, it's very hard to convey what really goes on. And so my choice to describe him as a figure like Macbeth was very deliberate, because I felt that is a better memo about him than a classical memo that just describes his kind of trajectory, because it allows you to look at this in a kind of Shakespearean mode. And we need these modes in order, in the same way that Mass and Margarita ends up, I think also with reference to Tbilisi, but that's another story. But Bulgakov makes reference to the Bible in order to be able to convey what actually goes on in 1937. So it is almost something which incapacitates the way that we deal with that. What do you need in response? I would say that. I mean, I have made that argument. I'm thinking about writing a piece on that. You actually need a strategy. And so, unfortunately, what we've heard from some of the people in the opposition spectrum was a little bit, well, we have to stay on Rustaveli, and then eventually the cavalry will come, we'll get more sanctions. That's not a strategy. And I think, there's almost, if you look across these cases of these various authoritarians, there's almost a clear logic in my mind to what a strategy needs to be. And in my mind, there are typically 4 pillars. I don't know whether we want to get into that. If it's
why not? Well, yeah. So please.
In the end, you could say there are these 4 distinct pillars, and again, in various ways that applies to cases like Orban, or could apply, and also describe the difficulty of applying to cases like Putin, where you have essentially authoritarian people that mobilize a nativist rhetoric to dismantle a classical understanding of democracy, which is which is, we'll try to do our best, but we understand that we need to take turns. That would be in a nutshell. Of course, it's more complicated than the way that I've offered it. But so, what is a sensible strategy? You need to pierce a bubble that is around there that says, actually, this kind of zero-sum game and really treating your opponents as the enemy and as people that need to be subjugated, that rhetoric is something you need to challenge. And we've seen that done quite successfully in the United States. The Lincoln Project, they haven't prevailed, but in terms of pitching back the messages, in Britain, it's something like Led by Donkeys that really helps pierce the kind of Brexit bubble there. So piercing that propaganda bubble, in some contexts, it's going to be very, very hard. I think in Georgia, it's not so hard because of the internal inconsistencies of the Georgian Dream. The second thing that you need to do is disabling particular enablers. And in some cases, that's what sanctions sometimes try to do in other contexts. There are cases in Georgia where people still do rather well in terms of traveling. There are cases in Russia where some of the enablers live very well in London or send their kids to. And this is something because these regimes rely on enablers, and keeping them on side is challenging. Then I think you need to often disrupt their decision making. And how well you can do that again depends on context. And then the fourth thing, and this is what we're struggling with here in Georgia at the moment, is you need to revive politics and the idea that there might be hope. So we've seen that with in New York with Mamdani, as a figure that comes in, and you could say that he could go, oh, everything's horrible, and kind of, but there is an element of hope. And of course, there's going to be a degree of disappointment because you campaign in poetry and you govern in prose. But that idea of reviving hope, or we see that with Peter Magyar in Hungary, and I think I know that Georgians have, and many people rightly have complicated feelings about Alexei Navalny because he also appealed to nationalism. I think it is unavoidable to need to appeal to nationalist sentiment, but Alexei Navalny was trying to do the same in Russia. And you need to revive that. That's also one of the reasons why I have this very controversial view. That's a minority point of view that I think if I was a Georgian politician, I would go into local elections.
You would or wouldn't?
I would absolutely. Would. And with the view of saying something like, I want to fight for this country. Mm-hmm. And I got into politics not because it's easy, but because it's hard. That's a kind of a line that Kennedy has somewhere. And I want to talk to as many citizens as possible about how to set the country back on the track where it should be. And this is what I'm going to do until they lock me up or until I breathe my last breath. And I don't care in the end of how unfair the fight is. I'm going to get into that arena to do it. That's the way you inspire people. And the problem about kind of going, well, it might be unfair. Well, of course it will be unfair. But fixing Georgia, bringing Georgia back onto the track, that's going to be an incredibly difficult task. And so I think you need to have that communicate that you have a confidence against the odds, that you have a chance of prevailing. And so that's a very different point of view from we may have a chance of succeeding or etc. So if I say I would go in, it's not because I think the situation is good enough, because I think the situation is so bad with regards to the politics that you do need to revive politics. It's not, as some opposition politicians have said, and I very much respect that, many people across that spectrum, but have said it's political suicide to go in. I think realistically opposition parties are dead already. So the question is, how do we revive? But again, I mean, if we zoom out from that and the large points is, you've got to think about that broad group of people that are supporting, and typically it's 20-30% that you need to reach. You need to think about the actual enablers and disabling them. You need to disrupt decision-making overall, and then you need to actually revive hope in politics. And again, I think that's true across the board. And those are challenges we face in Germany also, where now I'm getting much into details, but across the European Union, and there are problems with the European Union answer to the present moment, because the idea was that you create a web of rights that individual citizens enjoy, which is great, but it's also meant that in many cases you've depoliticized. You've depoliticized what the state can do. And we have this critique with Ezra Klein, who says, how is it possible that we're not capable of building high-speed rail in California? And this is China built something like 20,000 kilometers. And Ezra Klein says, I don't want our country to be like China, but I want high-speed rail. And we need to have, these democracies need to repoliticize to actually offer solutions and not go in all points of, well, what are we supposed to do? Which is... So those are challenges. And the good news is this is a chance across these places for our generation to stand up for something. And that isn't tied to a direct chance of success. But sometimes doing the right thing is, you do the right thing not because you have an immediate chance of success, but because it's the right thing to do.
Very interesting, very interesting. And now let's go a little bit zoom out from the Georgian politics, and let's say that, for example, for the last 25 years, Georgia to be part of Western world, to be part of democratic world, part of European Union and NATO, that has always been a dream.
Yes.
A very distant dream, I would say. But now, when you see what is happening in Europe, geopolitics, the opportunities that is brought by geopolitics, now it is reality. We've never been so close to be part of European project. But at the same time, we've never been so close to be a dictatorship. Even in dark 90s, when things were really tough here in Georgia, the power was not consolidated in the way it is consolidated now. But at the same time, we all realize that being a dictatorship at the same time and be part of democratic world, that's impossible. That's the water and oil. That doesn't really go together. But also we understand that this window of opportunity opens and closes as it goes, and it's not 100% up to you, or it doesn't really depend on you when it opens and when it closes. For example, in the early 2000s, that this window of opportunity opened in the European Union and NATO, and the half of the countries from former Soviet, former socialist republics kind of managed to get into that, step into that. And there was like mutual readiness from both sides in the way that the Western world and European Union, NATO was ready to expand and open up. And also there was political will and also, again, attempt and effort from former Soviet, former socialist countries basically to go into that. And I think that similar times are coming at the end of 2030 when there could be another big bang expansion of the European Union with another 10 countries or so, which happens maybe once in a half a century or once in a quarter century, but it doesn't happen every year or every 5 years. And this opportunity, a golden opportunity that is so close, within the reach, because of what is happening in Georgia, because of our local problems, we are missing this opportunity. Or at least, of course, we still have a few years to get back on the track and still catch up with this big project. But if we miss this opportunity, the way I see it, it wouldn't come back soon after that. So how do you see this? How important for Georgia as a country you think that is to use this opportunity that is opening up now, or it is open because of what Russia did in Ukraine, because of how Ukraine tried to defend themselves, and this was Ukraine's response to Russia that opened this opportunity for everyone.
Well,
or maybe Georgians are over-dramatizing everything as we normally do in terms of European Union. If we are not part of this wave of European Union expansion, then it might never come.
No, I think there's a very real risk, and I mean the German ambassador has said that very clearly, and that has also, I mean, that people in kind of had a more reflective take on that inside the European Union. People like Günther Oettinger have talked about, when you criticize, why did the EU extend the euro to Greece, or why did they expand quite quickly in a few cases, the argument he made, well, the windows of history, they sometimes open, and then they're not necessarily open for that long. And then you will make mistakes on the way, as was made with a euro in Greece, or as was made in unification in the German case, which some of the cost is now coming back. But if you wait, the idea that then things will necessarily be a lot better is that doesn't really that often doesn't happen either, and the opportunities then really get lost, and with dramatic consequences. So I mean, I think right now, given that this is a moment of crisis, I mean, my own sense is where exactly this ends up. There's a way that if you look at all the factors in there, it's quite easy to get paralyzed. It's quite easy, and I mean, my own sense was in February 2022, with a full-scale assault on Ukraine, was that my own sense was this is going to be 10 years of turbulence. And that the reason why that I would say that almost helps me right now, not helps me, I don't need to be helped, but still why I think that is still a useful framing is because when things then don't go in the way that you would hope them to go, you go, well, we're just in the beginning of the middle, and you understand that you need to run this as a marathon, and that doom scrolling at every point, and that jumping on everything that you see on Facebook, so to speak, isn't going to be the solution to that. And so I think in the end, this is really a profound test in the sense of a crisis, which is a question to individuals about what do they understand their citizenship to be. Yeah, and that to me, I mean, you're doing this podcast now, but I think for other people also the question is, what are you actually doing day to day? Is that, if you do task management, is there something that integrates into task management? Do you have a folder for the kinds of things you're doing? Because this is not just something where by clicking a few things or maybe turning up in a protest once or twice that you're necessarily going to move. And then that aggregates all the way up to institutions. And it's a profound challenge, I think, for all the institutions that are involved. And it is a challenge also to some people and again, we've seen a lot of people resign. Yeah, I don't know the story behind the resignation of Mr. Davitashvili, who was one of the ministers who comparatively had a still better reputation, or of someone like Irakli Karsaladze, who I think was broadly seen as a real competent. I would be surprised if this didn't somewhere figure in that some of these people also had their own thinking and said, there's only so much of what I'm willing to be part of. But so this, in the end, where the overall where things are going to evolve, because so many questions, we can take this to Taiwan, we can take this in so many different directions, and U.S. internal politics. And I think the challenge for us is to see all the bad news and to be realistic about that, but then also to ask, what is the particular thing that I'm going to focus on? And that may be insignificant in the larger scheme of things, but really to focus on that. And again, one of the interesting discussions in the United States context was someone who said at some point, imagine we had Twitter or X or Blue Sky or Facebook in the 1930s, how paralyzed many of us would have been with all the bad news that was flooding in from everywhere. And that in the end, maybe it was quite a good thing that people limited themselves to reading a newspaper and maybe listening a bit to the radio and then actually getting on with things. And that's a challenge, I think. So we can see those challenges, I think, for individuals. And I think that's what's being asked of us, so to speak. And that sounds maybe melodramatic, but really the question of what individuals do and how that aggregates into a larger whole, and to understand that it's not going to be over even in a year, even if miraculously Bidzina Ivanishvili decided to step in a plane or to head the next mission to Mars. The country would go with all the things that have, all the judges, all the policemen that gave false testimony, all the other bad things that have happened. This is going to be, setting the country back on track is anyway going to be a huge challenge.
Thank you very much. So we could discuss a lot more things, but time is against us. Once again, thank you very much. Would you like to add something or a specific point or to make, or maybe...
No, well, look,
throw in some more topic, I don't know, maybe geopolitics, whatever.
One could talk about, obviously these are very rich topics that one can talk about for a long time. I would really say that I think I really value precisely that kind of engagement, because these are unprecedented questions. I think it's important to be respectful of people having a range of different views on those, because in normal politics, reasonable people can agree quite quickly. And these are not normal times. Absolutely. And for that reason, it's even more important using the spaces of universities, of scholarship, of something like this format, podcasting format, where you can tease things out and where it's not just a little kind of, snippet of 500 words of an op-ed. And so, thank you for making this possible. And I think this is a constructive contribution at a time like this.
Thank you once again. Thank you for watching us, listening to us. Please like us, subscribe to us, and I'll see you next week.